So, I don't know if you guys want to sit maybe there?
Yeah, all right.
No.
Whenever you're ready. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. We're pleased today to have the Canada launch of the Global Terrorism Index. First time in Canada that we've launched this important report. For many of you know that terrorism is a global threat and a domestic issue. Canada has had terrorism attacks here at the Canadian Parliament, had attacks against the Muslim minority in Quebec City, and we've seen a rise of non-state armed groups in parts of the Sahel, Mali, fighting peacekeepers, Burkina Faso. We've had Canadian citizens be attacked and lost their lives there, an increasing number of attacks, including against Canadian mining firms. So terrorism is unfortunately an issue that's not going away, and but the Global Terrorism Index provides the most detailed analysis of what is happening across the globe. And with that, I'd like to invite Serge Strobants of the Institute for Economics of Peace to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much. The Institute for Economics and Peace is a non-for-profit, independent and apolitical think tank based in Sydney, Australia, but having a global outreach through several regional offices. And I'm directing the office in Europe and the MENA region, and I'm the Security and Defense Specialist at the Institute for Economics and Peace. So for this year's Global Terrorism Index 2019, we have seen several key findings. The first one, we have seen a decrease in the amount of casualties, amount of people killed by terrorism by 15%. So this is an evolution that we have seen since the peak in 2014. And over the period of the last 4 to 5 years, we have seen a decrease by 52% in the amount of casualties. Just short of 34,000 in 2014 and about 16,000 last year. So that's very positive news. On the other hand, we also saw that last year, 71 countries have been targeted by terrorist groups and 71 countries in which there was at least one person killed by terrorism. This is the second highest number of countries targeted in the past decade. So we clearly see a decrease in the effectiveness of the attacks and the amount of death that are caused by terrorism. But we also see that the phenomenon called terrorism is spreading throughout the world and in many, many countries throughout the world. So that's very disturbing. The second key finding would go to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, for the first time since 2003, is the country most impacted by terrorism. It has been Iraq for the last 15 to 16 years. So that's a huge evolution, and we see that 2 out of the 4 most deadly groups in the world are operating only in this country. So I'm calling the Taliban, of course, that is responsible for 38% of all deaths by terrorism last year, and also the Khorasan chapter of the Islamic State. If you put those 2 groups together, this is almost 50% of all casualties in the past year. A third key finding is the rise of far-right terrorism. In the past 4 years, this impact has grown by 320%. And if we look at the figures of this year compared to the previous year, this trend is continuing and even increasing in the amount of casualties that have been counted this year. A fourth finding, or fourth trend, is the relation between violent conflict and terrorism. We clearly see that the evolution in figures in the amount of people killed in combat or in a violent conflict and through terrorism are parallel. There is a clear correlation between this. 95% of all casualties from terrorism fall in a country that is having on its soil at least one violent conflict. And the last key finding, or the last key trend that we have seen in this year's Global Terrorism Index is about gender and terrorism. So we have seen that terrorist groups are using female perpetrators more and more. I would say there are 2 trends to this. The first trend is that those terrorist groups always want to keep the element of surprise, always want to be a step ahead of the security and intelligence services, and try to invent new techniques and tactics and procedures to be effective. And those intelligence and security services did not really put the focus on female perpetrators. And I would say this is like a weakness that has been identified before. And we have seen that Boko Haram, for example, started to use this technique, and 80% of the peak of the use of female perpetrators is related to Boko Haram. The second trend that we see in this gender and terrorism result is the fact that more and more women are basically getting stuck in regions where combat was active before. So when we look at Syria and Iraq, for example, we see that more male perpetrators of foreign terrorist fighters were able to leave the region and return back to their countries of origin, where female, usually with young children, have much more difficulties to travel and get stuck in these areas of the world where terrorism is really at its best. As a conclusion, I would say that looking to the future, we of course expect the regions that are now most impacted, and this being South Asia with countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, being the Sahel region with countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Mozambique also when you look at Africa, and Nigeria. Those countries are most affected by terrorism at the moment, and this is clearly in line with these tactics of these terrorist groups to just find parts of the world where governance is low, where the efficiency of security and intelligence services is low also, where there is already a violent conflict going on, where they can just plug in their ideology, techniques and procedures. So I guess that's, in a nutshell, the results of the global terrorism of 2019. Thank you very much.
Now I would like to pass the floor to Phil Gursky, who's a program director at the University of Ottawa. Phil?
Great. Thanks, Kyle. So I'm a program director for security at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also a retired intelligence analyst with CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I want to commend the IEP for the report that they've done. I think it's important as Canadians. We live in a country which is blessedly not immune from terrorism, but certainly doesn't have the levels of terrorism that many other countries, including Western countries, have. But I think it's important for us as Canadians to have a global perspective on what's happening. Not so much that it will necessarily come to our shores at some point, but it gives us a better sense as to the terrorist trends that are out there and the impact that terrorism is having. And I would commend the IEP for this report. This is really a stellar report. And I think it's, in many ways, this is the 7th iteration of the report. And it is groundbreaking. I know I used to use it when I was at CSIS. And I think that as we talk about things here in Canada, about the terrorist threat and what we're to do about it, do we need to devote more resources to the far right? Is the far left a concern in this country? What about Islamist extremism? I think it's important at the same time to recognize it's all of the above simultaneously, and that we have to have a mature debate in this country about resource allocation to fight terrorism, whether it's by CSIS, the RCMP, or other agencies within the Canadian government. And for me, the IEP Global Terrorism Index provides the kind of really well-researched, well-written, well-established data on which to have this dialogue. So I'm very happy to be as part of this launch here in Canada. And again, I tip my hat to the IEP and the production of, yet again, a fantastic global report for 2019.
And just to make some closing comments, I think, just to reiterate what Phil says, this Global Terrorism Index, the report gives a global picture. And I sometimes feel that when discussing terrorism, even in Canada, we don't look at the global picture. We look at the individual person, but we have to look and see at the ideologies that are driving these people, the grievances, the global conflicts. There's a connection through the internet and social media platforms that allow people to organize in groups. So we have to, I think, be more ambitious in looking at how to deal with this as a global issue, not just a domestic one, but a global one as well. Canada can make a contribution supporting the UN in its missions, peacekeeping missions, and the human rights agencies do investigations. There's a lot that we can do, and I hope Canada will seize this report and see it as an important indicator of where the world is going, and that what we can do to deal with non-state actors that will use violence against civilian populations. Thank you.
Martin Stringer from CPAC. Mr. Strombas, if I could ask you about one of your findings, you sort of paint a picture where, at least for now, the trend is away from what you call MENA, I mean Europe and the Middle East, and it's back towards Afghanistan. Is it a question of the political nature of the conflicts, or is it a question of the opportunism of terrorism, or both, all of the above?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I think it's really based on the opportunity. Of course, when you look at those 15% decrease last year, 50% on the 4 past years, this is clearly linked to a military effort in Syria and Iraq. The international coalition against Daesh. We have similar results in Nigeria when we see a coordination between the Nigerian Defense and Security Forces together with the Multinational Joint Task Force, making sure that Boko Haram is crushed. And so I guess, yeah, we are fighting the consequences. We are fighting the capabilities and in a very good way. And therefore, we see a reduction in the amount of casualties. On the other hand, we did not really find the ideology. We did not really find the root causes. And those terrorist groups will just redistribute and go to other places where the conditions, I would say, the fertile soil for their ideology and their techniques and procedures are present. So low levels of governance, low levels of effectiveness of the security and intelligence forces. And as I said, already a violent conflict going on where you can just plug in. We saw, for example, in 2019, attacks in Sri Lanka, the Easter attacks, where we saw kind of a federating effect of ISIL present in this country that is going to federate smaller groups and enable them to commit this type of attacks also. So they are just redistributing, looking for new opportunities and really fertile soil, fertile ground for their activities to thrive.
To all of you or any of you, reflect on the far-right terrorism, to what extent it resembles, to what extent it doesn't, and where you see it.
Well, when we talk about far-right terrorism, of course, it's a movement that has, we have seen a strong evolution, 320% over the past 4 years. But we are only talking about 19 countries in the western part of the world, so Northern America, Western Europe, and Oceania. Last year, 26 casualties through far-right terrorism. This year, already 79. So by completion of the GTI, we counted 77. And of course, we need to add the 2 victims of the synagogue attack in Halle in Germany, where we were very lucky to have strong doors to the synagogue. Otherwise, I think we might have doubled the number of casualties this year. So that's why I said that we are going to have an even stronger evolution in the next Global Terrorism Index when you look at those figures. What we see for far-right terrorism is that the narrative is at the moment strong enough to motivate people to use violence to make the point of what is written in this narrative. And we see an evolution of manifestos being passed from one actor to the other. We do not see large terrorist groups or large terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State acting as the organizers and the implementers of those attacks. So there is a clear difference there between what we see in far-right terrorism and, of course, in figures. This is still marginal. It's less than 100 compared to 16,000 casualties. So the problem of terrorism is definitely somewhere else in the world where people get killed by this phenomenon. But we need to keep a close eye on this evolution.
As a statistician, just a question about the far right. As a statistician or someone who goes through the statistics, how difficult is it in modern industrialized societies, or especially the United States, to determine whether something's far-right terrorism or if it's mental health issues and access to guns?
I think it's a very good question. What we saw also in the index this year is that over a period of in the past 20 to 30 years, more mass shootings have been recognized as terrorist acts. So about 20% of the mass shootings are today recognized as terrorist acts, and we saw an increase of this recognition in the past years. I think there is maybe a clear connection there to the legal tools that are given to investigators and prosecutors when an attack receives attack terrorism. This allows them, especially in the first stages of investigation and prosecution, to go much further than, I would say, the regular legal and democratic tools that they have at their disposal. What we see is that usually those type of events are tagged as terrorists, and then sometimes afterwards you see that there is a downgrade to regular crime or to violent crime. And we had a perfect example of this a couple of weeks ago, where on the same date we had a stabbing and the attacks on the London Bridge. That was a terrorist attack and has been labeled as such. And then we had stabbings also in the city of The Hague in the Netherlands, who started as being seen as a potential terrorist attack, and in the hours and days after the attack was downgraded to a normal violent crime.
If I can pick up on that, you know, when you're looking at whether something is terrorism or not, you need to prove motivation. And sometimes that's very difficult. So you go back to the attack in Quebec City in January 2017, Mr. Bissonnette was not charged with a terrorism offense. He was charged with first-degree murder because that's easier to prove in a court of law. And so I think that the Crown, the prosecution in Canada, will often make that calculation. But furthermore, to your other question about, you know, the far right versus Islamist extremism, what we're also seeing is sort of a tit for tat. So if you go back to the attacks in Christchurch in March, or rather in February of this year, the manifesto that was produced by the terrorist claimed it was in retribution for an Islamist attack in Stockholm in 2017. And then the Islamist extremist attacks in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday, the claim that was made by Islamic State was that this was in retribution for Christchurch. So it's almost like you're getting a one-upmanship in which an attack that kills Muslims is being used as the fodder or the justification for attack against non-Muslims. And so you're almost like getting this ramping up for attention and this ramping up for, well, they're doing it to us, we're going to do it to them. And one further point that Sarah did talk about with Islamic State, yes, Daesh has been, for the large part, the caliphate is defeated. It's no longer there, but Daesh is still very much present in Syria and Iraq. Just talked to the Iraqis about this. But also, as Sarah alluded to, we have dozens of Islamic State affiliates around the world. Some of which are becoming very, very lethal. Sarah's mentioned Islamic State in Khorasan, the most lethal of all the Islamic State affiliates. Islamic State in West Africa is vying for influence with Boko Haram. We have an Islamic State affiliate in the Congo called the ADC. We have other ones that are equal parts of Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So this phenomenon of Islamic State, whatever you want to call it, has not disappeared. It's simply, it's reformed itself. And Sarah's also mentioned ideology. The way I look at it is it's like a balloon. And when you put pressure on one part of the balloon, it simply goes somewhere else. So we may have defeated a particular group, or rather damaged a particular group. What we have failed to do, largely speaking internationally, is to undermine the ideology. So it simply manifests itself somewhere else. So, as much, and I do commend what Sarah said, there's a significant decrease in fatalities since 2014. That's a great start, and that's very good news. But the threat has not really gone away, and it'll simply find another vehicle with which to manifest itself. And that's why it's important, I think, to remain vigilant.
Okay, just two quick questions. And because of your description of ISIL or Daesh as being so tentacular around the world, has it replaced that original intention of Al-Qaeda? Al-Qaeda was supposed to be the network, and now we see ISIL becoming the worldwide network.
Yes and no. There still are Al-Qaeda affiliates around the world. Al-Shabaab in Somalia is an Al-Qaeda linked, or they see themselves as Al-Qaeda. There is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is also vying for influence with an Islamic State affiliate in Yemen. We see Al-Qaeda groups, obviously, in Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. To me, it's almost like a friendly competition. And I'm glad you raised Al-Qaeda, because many people have said that's yesteryear's threat. Bin Laden was killed in 2011. That's now eight and a half years ago, and Al-Qaeda was superseded by Islamic State. And certainly in terms of lethality, as Sarah's pointed out, there's no question that Islamic State was much more lethal from 2014 on. But Al-Qaeda never went away. They're still there. They're still regrouping. And yes, Ayman al-Zawahiri is not Bin Laden. He's not charismatic, but there are any number of terrorist groups that still see Al-Qaeda as something to emulate. So we've almost got more of a problem than we have less of a problem right now. And we have large terrorist groups that are spawning affiliates, and then that third level, which we call the inspired, which have no actual, definitive link to a terror. And most of the terrorist attacks we've had in Canada, either foiled or successful, have been by wannabes, people who see themselves as representative of Islamic State or Al-Qaeda historically. And that's another level of threat, which perhaps in this country actually represents the greatest level. But even then, it's at a fairly minimum level when you compare it to what's happening in Afghanistan or Nigeria or whatever.
Any thoughts from any of you on the issue of ISIL or Daesh, former combatants? I hesitate to call them militants, but people returning to industrialized countries, and thoughts on what's happening and how to deal with it?
I'll briefly talk about sort of my position from a Canadian perspective. I support the government's position that we do not need to facilitate the return of Islamic State Daesh terrorists to Canada. We cannot prevent their return under the Charter. I do think that if they do return, they should be charged under the criminal code. Unfortunately, this is a real challenge. We just charged a man from Guelph this week with having attempted to join Islamic State from Turkey. That's a good start. We'll see if, in fact, those charges stick, if we gain a conviction or an acquittal. This is a hard thing to prove, given that the evidence you have to gather is evidence in a war zone. And intelligence, I know from my background in CSIS, intelligence is not evidence, is not used in Canadian courts. So I think the government is facing a very difficult situation. We're having Turkey, who is actually deporting Islamic State adherents to various European countries. It's probably only a matter of time before they deport some to Canada, if in fact there are some in Turkish custody. So this is not going away, and I think the tools that we have to deal with it are good tools, but they're limited tools. So I'll leave that to Sarah if he wants to talk about Islamic State Daesh returnees to other parts of the world.
Well, I mean, being director for the European region and also the MENA region, this is a topic where I come from. I think when you look at the narrative of a terrorist group like Islamic State, for example, they are completely destroying our values, norms and values and ideas of the West. And I think the only thing what we can put in front of them or to confront them are those norms and values that we defend in Western countries. And I think we obey by the rule of law, national law and international law. And I think we should start applying this and supporting this. So most of those people are nationals of one of, as you call them, industrialized countries. So I guess we have the governments of those countries have a responsibility towards their own nationals. And what we saw in previous research, and this was part of the report last year, is a different approach to returning foreign terrorist fighters in the West or industrialized countries, as you call them, where, of course, we were very reluctant to get them back. And when they get back, we have a wide array of possibilities of in the reception of those foreign terrorist fighters, ranging from direct imprisonment, indictment, and then, of course, trying to put them away or to keep them away from society. And then you of course, have the other extreme, the example of Denmark, that is presenting a full reintegration and de-radicalization program to those people. I think the countries involved have a responsibility towards their own nationals. To the other hand, you see countries in the region that were provided most of the foreign terrorist fighters. They would go more for those reintegration programs, making sure that those people can come back into the society, reintegrate, and become regular members of society again. So, yeah, different approaches.
I like to add one thing. If I could just add, I think every country around the world is struggling what to do with returning ISIS fighters. However, I think we need to look at these individuals, the group that they join, the enterprise of death that was put together. Contravenes so many different international human rights laws. Genocide was committed against the Yazidis, crimes against humanity, against religious minorities, recruitment of child soldiers, destruction of UNESCO cultural property. There were so many things that were done that makes their crimes international, not just domestic ones. And I think it requires that over the long term, we hear these groups are remorphing. We really have to have an approach of how do we deal with these transnational groups and prosecute them for breaking international law.
A last question maybe about logistics. Is there an extra spanner been thrown in the works by the fact that Turkey has now imposed a security zone? Many of the ISIL militants were held in Kurdish custody. Have we lost track of a lot of them? I mean, a lot of people, for example, the famous John Letts and people like that were in Kurdish custody. Has that changed because of the Turkish incursion into those parts of Kurdish-occupied Iraq and Syria?
Well, I mean, this question is outside, of course, of the results of the Global Terrorism Index. Yes, of course. I mean, Western governments were very well aware of who was in custody, where they were, and who was accounted for. This has changed now. Some of the prisons in the northern part of Syria has been, are not prisons anymore, and people are on the run. Therefore, a lot fled into Turkey, have been in custody there, and are starting to be repatriated. I mean, I come from Belgium myself. We received the first two female members of ISIS a couple of weeks ago, came back to Belgium. So yes, this process also already started, and not all people that were accounted for before are still accounted for today. Yeah, that's correct.
Can I just add one quick thing? Under Canadian law, it is an offense to join a terrorist group, irrespective of what you did for the terrorist group, whether or not you participated in acts of heinous acts against humanity, war crimes, or whatever. It is an offense on the criminal code. And that's what's happened in the case of the young man from Guelph who was charged last week. Again, as I said earlier, the challenge is to find enough evidence that will stand the very high and rightfully high standard of proof we have in a Canadian court. This is why I think many countries have hesitated to repatriate their citizens, because of the fear that they simply would not have the wherewithal and the critical mass of evidence required to obtain a conviction. And this is why they prefer to let the Kurds take them. Of course, the Kurds told us, well, we can't handle them. We're not a state. We don't have the facilities to do this. And there was that sort of back and forth between. And I think in the meantime, with Turkey having made the incursion into northern Iraq and northern Syria, that certainly, as Serge has pointed out, has really made a mess of things, because what were then terrorists held in custody to some extent, that custody has disappeared. I think I'm a glass kind of half full kind of guy. The majority probably will not return to terrorism. What happens to them remains to be seen. But the fact that we don't know where they are anymore is obviously of concern to security agencies like CSIS and their counterparts around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Super.
Now off to Global Affairs Canada.